Thank you so much for sticking with us, because the moment that many of you will have been waiting for is to get the big picture analysis from those who have, as I say, reported on it, lived it, breathed it. Let's welcome Brian Taylor and Bernard Ponsonby to round off the evening. Come over to the middle here. Thank you. Great to see you both. It's a rare occurrence to get two legends on the same sofa.
I was on a TV programme with Bernard and I described this as the Waldorf and Statler of Scottish politics. I don't think he was too happy. I can see why. He's considerably younger than I am, but I was meant those. You know, remember the two grumpy old gits in the Muppets? Well, I reckon that.
How would you describe Geoff and Andy?
Well, the way you described me at half-time, he said, if I'm fucking here in about 10...
the young and upcoming Aberdein supporter, I hope your team do wonderfully this year. Look, you had a tremendous panel tonight, absolutely fabulous panel. When I looked at the list preparing for tonight, I thought, my God, mine was the only name I'd never heard of. I was really impressed. Good stuff.
Go on, Bernard, as we, trying to capture a bit of the themes of this evening, considering 25 years that have been, looking ahead, what would you pick out from tonight as the kind of, I suppose, is it about learning lessons? Is it about what happens next? I don't know. How are you reflecting this evening?
Well, people have told their own stories, and I think that in terms of institutionally, the Parliament has been a success, because nobody can now imagine Scotland being governed without the Scottish Parliament. And in that very real and palpable sense, it has been a success. In the very last year, before the devolution referendum at Westminster, 4 hours was devoted to Scottish housing. 4 hours. The third sector had no relationship with its parliament. People didn't have a profound relationship with its parliament. So in a very real and a very palpable way, institutionally, it has been a success. We have heard about the various policies of the various administrations which have taken the country forward. But if I may just play devil's advocate for a moment, 180,000 people in Scotland are still on waiting lists for social housing. Why is that the case after 25 years where the Parliament has had control? And the one thing that I think has characterised quite a lot of the administrations is that the overwhelming political approach to government has been one of managerialism. Wendy Alexander talked about Donald Dewar being a Croslandite socialist. Well, you know, the social democratic model of delivering a just society is bust. It was bust a long time ago. You simply can't tax and spend in order to deliver public services. And yet, as Susan Deakin said, no real debate about where the allocation of scarce resources go. I merely ask the question rhetorically. Are the things that the Parliament has done that is free, the opportunity cost of doing that is that you don't spend in other areas? And, you know, local government, as the Auditor General has pointed out, councillors deliver services, MSPs don't, and yet they're in the front line of cuts. And I simply do not see that there is anyone today with an overarching philosophy which will put public services on a sustainable footing, given that what's coming down the line with the projections on public expenditure from 2025 are actually quite horrific.
It's a question of consensus, or rather... In the very early days of the Parliament, when Henry McLeish set up that standing group to try and do the rules and regulations for the way the Parliament would run, there was much talk of consensus. It was misunderstood then, it's misunderstood now. It did not mean agreement on everything. It did not mean that things would be solved by a group hug and a collective rendering of kumbaya. It meant that you agreed in common what the problems are. One that is staring us in the face that we need to agree in common what the problems are is the one that we all find collectively, and certainly political parties find collectively impossible to do, and that is the National Health Service. It is almost obligatory to attach the word our beloved National Health Service or our wonderful National Health Service. It is neither of those things. It is in a perilous state and in a dreadful state, and we need to recognise collectively that it requires a reduction of demand by encouraging a reduction of demand and enhanced productivity by those who are delivering the health care. But you cannot say that, because the minute you say that, you are accused by your opponents of attacking the NHS, having a go at the wonderful nurses. We've got to collectively agree. I mean, I agree with Bernard on the ones he mentions. I would stress the NHS. So we need some consensus on what the problem is, and then you have an intelligent argument around the ways in which to address that.
25 years of devolution, and yet the essential shape of the Scottish state is exactly the same. 131 quangos, 32 local authorities duplicating all of this stuff. The opportunity cost, if you could reorganise local government, as it should have been reorganised quite some time ago, you should be road testing your policies against whether or not they make the country a more socially just place to live in. We do it in relation to net zero. Every single pound of public expenditure, if you're a left of centre politician, should be earmarked against whether or not it makes your country socially just. Having 32 local authorities with all of that duplication doesn't make sense. 61% of households in this country are in the wrong council tax band. That ain't fair. Jack McConnell got a report before the 2007 election, the Butt report, which was an entirely decent report, which was progressive, which was socially just, and it was binned because it didn't sit comfortably with the electoral cycle. Alec came into office pledging to abolish the unfair council tax. We've still got it. They also pledged to abolish student debt. They've still got it. So the point that I'm making is that you sometimes have to have honest debates about where scarce resources go. And it means eyeballing people in the country about the kind of social contract which will make public services sustainable, because at the moment everything depends on the management of the political cycle, what gets a headline on television the following day, and how do you outsmart your opponents in an election, and that ain't what government's about.
You mentioned the headlines. You mentioned the headlines there, Bernard, and that is a key point. I think the media have a role to play with regard to that, not in helping to formulate policy or anything of the sort, but in the way in which we scrutinise politics. I think we get it wrong in two ways. First of all, we insist upon purity of answers, and politics does this as well. A minister, the honest answer, when a minister is asked, what are you thinking of doing about this, is for her to stand up and say, I haven't a clue, what would you do? That's the honest answer. That's the true perspective. Have you got some ideas? And one or two really brave souls like Malcolm Chisholm as health minister, and would you believe it, God blimey, Michael Forsyth, when he was Secretary of State in the first days, tried to do some of that. The second one is that genuinely there is a bogus certainty evinced by our politicians and bogus fights. He said, she retorted. They describe their opponents as the embodiment of all evil. They don't believe it for a second, but they are encouraged by the media to know that that's the sort of thing that gets you on the wireless or gets you a headline in the Record, and it is, and therefore they continue with that. If the media were to say, if we were to say collectively, we're not putting that tosh out anymore, can you talk seriously about the state of the economy and the state of the health service, you know what, I think the debate would change. I think I don't know who started it first, but we need a truce between the media and
the issue
politics.
of scandal in 25 years, Henry McLeish resigned on an issue which was not a scandal. It should not have forced out a First Minister. Wendy Alexander resigned as the leader of her party over a £600 cheque. And the problem with scandals is that not only do you not have any consensus, but when some individual in a political party displays the frailty of the human condition, the first thing that the people in other parties play is they play politics with it, knowing they've got their own colleagues who exhibit the frailties of the human condition. Very few things in the last 25 years have been a scandal. The loss of £250 million in the Clyde is a scandal. There's been a lot of scandal with public, but does that get the scrutiny that it deserves? No, it doesn't. But people play politics with whether or not somebody tweeted something useless at midnight and all the rest of it. The politicians also have to just grow up a bit.
I think I agree with that. I think the problems on the Clyde have been highlighted endlessly by the Herald. Come on, I'm allowed one plug, for God's sake. But you make a good point there with regard to the way matters are treated. I worked in Westminster for 6 years in the 1980s, and I had a colleague then who was on The Sun, and he was asked by his paper, I want more scandal. And he turned to me and he said, Brian, there's plenty of scandals around here, but I'm involved in most of them. So I don't know how I'm going to be able to cover it. Talk about hypocrisy within our own dear trade.
Listen to this. This is brilliant.
It's brilliant. I also legend. I kind of feel like I'm sitting in on a campaign launch.
Absolutely.
For the two of you.
Ponsonby part, the Ponsonby Taylor part.
Just then, as you bring our night to the most brilliant conclusion,
That's very kind.
You've seen the polling, you've heard the people who were there at the birth of devolution and who masterminded it, and those who have worked within it and tried to change it and all of that over the last 25 years. Is it possible to predict, Bernard, what will happen? What is now the will of the Scottish people when it comes to devolution from here on out?
Well, I think that one of the interesting things was when Alec was talking about going to see Donald Dewar at Bute House, and they agreed a form of words in a parliamentary exchange which would allow the SNP to campaign for a yes vote in 97. Donald's view always was devolution was a process, not an event. The problem is too many people actually think that it's an event, and there's not enough thinking that's going on, because that constitutional settlement, which the SNP signed up to, manifestly imprisons the ability of the Scottish Parliament to hold a referendum, because there is effectively a veto. Now, you don't need to be a supporter of Scottish independence to think that a constitutional settlement that doesn't allow you to have the right to express your view is a constitutional settlement which is not fit for purpose. And I'm simply perplexed as to why the current SNP leadership don't actually make a lot more of that. The Labour Party managed to move forward by taking control of the constitutional debate. In the 1970s, there was the two efforts to legislate for the Scottish Assembly. Then they went into the Constitutional Convention. Then they legislated for it. They were always slightly ahead of the game, which meant that they partly defined the narrative. Now, they have very little or nothing to say about this, which is in part why they have, I think, been on the wrong side of the debate about change. So what I would like to see is a bit more ideas, because Scottish politics is an ideas-free zone at the moment.
And Brian, final word.
Yeah, I heard people earlier say that they were too young to remember the referendum in 1997. I covered that. I also covered the one in 1979, which probably makes me feel slightly older than most of the people in the hall, including covering Tam Diel's contributions at the time. But I recall also, you mentioned earlier that George Robertson, when he was Shadow Secretary of State, had said that devolution will kill the SNP stone dead. People think that was a speech. He actually said it in an interview with me, done in Edinburgh at COSLA headquarters at Haymarket just after a meeting of the convention. I remember being stunned by it and putting it out prominently on the TV. And when I was feeling slightly mischievous, which I must confess is a fairly frequent occurrence, I would phone George up and say, "How's that project going?" And he would grumph loudly and
he also promised
gently,
a bonfire of the Quangos.
Yeah. We got the bonfire of the vanities to come as well. But I don't think that is happening. Although in the last few weeks and months, who knows? Perhaps it's moving in a different direction. I think you talk about the situation. We have to bear in mind that if you're sitting in Westminster, they don't see Scotland on a solitary basis. They see the structure across the UK. Tony Blair repeatedly tried. To his credit, he went ahead with devolution despite being sceptical, but he because he believed it was the settled will of the people. But he tried to place it in a UK context, tried to talk about it in the context of devolution of the English regions. The committee that we had, that Donald attended, was DSWR, Devolution to Scotland, Wales and the regions, chaired by Derry Irvine. If you know the background there, you'll know why that was a problem for Donald Dewar, and with Jack Straw and others, John Prescott causing considerable problems. So they always set it entirely reasonably in a UK context, Scotland doesn't see it that way. And the reason the SNP has done relatively well in the past decade and more has been that they say they stand up for the interests of the people of Scotland, while their rivals are always having to glance over their shoulder at the interests of London and the UK. For as long as that sustains, and for as long as the people of Scotland are thinking that way, the SNP will do relatively, and I stress relatively well. The reason the Tories recovered for a period was because they were placed in contradistinction to the SNP as being the most prominent party advocating independence and the Conservatives being the most prominent party advocating the Union. As long as it became that corralled battle, then the Tories would do relatively well. Labour is trying to talk about almost anything else but...
Relatively well would be very
relative.
relative.
There's a sticking point for them, about 30-odd%.
Thank you both very, very much.
That's amazing.
Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you so much for watching. Press subscribe and you'll get all the best videos offering insight on Scottish politics delivered straight to your feed. Press subscribe and stick around. And if you'd like to hear our conversations in full, open up your podcast app and search for Holyrood Sources.